I am 104 years old, and if there is one truth I wish someone had told me earlier in my life, it is this. Many of the diseases we fear most are not permanent sentences. In many cases, they are processes, slow biological processes, and processes can change direction. For most of my early adulthood, I believed what many people still believe today. When disease appears, the answer must come from a bottle, a prescription, or a hospital. Food, I thought, was simply fuel, something to quiet hunger and give the body enough energy to keep moving. I never imagined that what was on my plate each day could influence the microscopic machinery of my blood vessels, my metabolism, and the very chemistry inside my cells. But by the time I was in my late 60s, my body began to show the familiar signs of what doctors call chronic disease. My blood pressure had climbed steadily. My cholesterol numbers were drifting into dangerous territory. My energy was unpredictable, and my physician warned me that the early stages of metabolic disease were beginning to appear. At that time, the common expectation was simple. These conditions would gradually worsen with age. Medication could manage them, perhaps slow them. But the underlying process was believed to be largely irreversible. And yet, around that time, something unexpected crossed my path. Research that challenged that assumption. Scientists like Dr. Dean Ornish and Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn were publishing studies suggesting something extraordinary. Under certain conditions, heart disease itself could begin to move backward. Arteries that had been narrowing from plaque could stabilize and, in some cases, even show measurable regression. The common factor in those studies was not a new drug or surgical procedure. It was food. Specifically, a whole food plant-based diet, one rich in vegetables, fruits, legumes, and whole grains, combined with simple lifestyle changes. At first, I was skeptical, but what I discovered over the years that followed would change the course of my health and, quite possibly, the length of my life. I did not change my diet because I believed it would make me live to 100. I changed it because the alternative was becoming increasingly clear. At 69, I sat in a quiet examination room while my physician reviewed my blood work. My LDL cholesterol had risen far above the recommended range. My blood pressure had crept into what doctors politely call the danger zone. My fasting blood sugar was beginning to edge toward the threshold that signals insulin resistance. None of this was unusual for someone approaching 70. In fact, the doctor reassured me that millions of people experience the same pattern. Age, genetics, and lifestyle slowly reshape the body's internal environment. Arteries stiffen. Cholesterol particles accumulate along vessel walls. Blood vessels lose their flexibility. Glucose regulation becomes less efficient. The typical plan was straightforward. Medication for blood pressure, medication for cholesterol, and monitoring for the possibility of diabetes later. But something about that plan unsettled me. It did not address the question I kept returning to. Why was this happening in the first place? Around that time, I began reading about a series of clinical studies that were quietly challenging the long-held belief that heart disease was a one-way street. One of the most influential came from Dr. Dean Ornish, whose research followed patients with coronary artery disease placed on an intensive lifestyle program centered around a low-fat, whole-food, plant-based diet. What made the findings remarkable was not merely that symptoms improved, it was that the disease itself appeared to retreat. Using angiography to examine coronary arteries, researchers observed that plaque buildup, which had been narrowing the arteries, showed measurable regression in some patients. Blood flow improved, angina symptoms declined, and many participants were able to reduce or eliminate certain medications under medical supervision. Another physician, Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn of the Cleveland Clinic, documented similar outcomes in patients with advanced coronary disease. In individuals who strictly followed a plant-based nutritional pattern, the progression of arterial plaque often halted. In several cases, it began to reverse. For decades, we had assumed that plaque accumulation inside arteries was essentially permanent once established. But these studies suggested something different. The body possesses powerful repair mechanisms when the biological environment shifts in the right direction. The key was understanding what happens inside the arteries. Coronary artery disease begins when the inner lining of blood vessels, called the endothelium, becomes damaged. This delicate cellular layer regulates blood flow, inflammation, and vascular tone. When the endothelium is injured by chronic inflammation, high LDL cholesterol, oxidative stress, and excess saturated fat, it becomes more permeable. LDL particles can slip into the vessel wall, where they undergo oxidation. The immune system responds, sending inflammatory cells that attempt to clear the damage. Over time, these reactions form fatty streaks and plaques that slowly narrow the arterial passageway. But here is what fascinated me. The endothelium is not inert. It is alive, responsive, and capable of repair. The foods we eat influence that environment every single day. A diet centered around whole plant foods changes several biological systems at once. First, it dramatically increases dietary fiber, which binds cholesterol in the digestive tract and helps lower circulating LDL levels. Lower LDL means fewer particles available to infiltrate the artery wall. Second, plant foods are rich in antioxidants and polyphenols, compounds that help reduce oxidative stress. Oxidation of LDL is one of the key triggers that accelerates plaque formation. When oxidative damage is reduced, the inflammatory cascade inside the artery slows down. Third, many vegetables, especially leafy greens, contain nitrates that the body converts into nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is a signaling molecule that relaxes blood vessels and improves endothelial function. Healthy endothelium produces more nitric oxide, which keeps arteries flexible and improves circulation. And finally, plant-based diets tend to be naturally low in saturated fat and free of dietary cholesterol. Over time, this shift reduces the lipid burden that contributes to plaque accumulation. When I first learned these mechanisms, the idea seemed almost too simple. Could something as ordinary as vegetables, beans, oats, and fruit really influence the microscopic processes occurring inside my arteries? There was only one way to find out, so I changed how I ate. Not gradually, but decisively. My meals became built around whole grains like oats and brown rice, beans and lentils, vegetables of every color, fruits, nuts, and seeds. Animal products became rare, then eventually disappeared from my daily routine. Within months, subtle changes began to appear. My blood pressure began drifting downward. My energy stabilized. Blood tests showed my LDL cholesterol falling steadily, but the most profound changes became visible over the following years. My physician monitored my markers closely, triglycerides dropped, blood sugar stabilized, my need for certain medications decreased under supervision. What I came to understand was that the body is not static, it is constantly responding to its environment. When the internal environment improves, when inflammation falls, when oxidative stress decreases, when blood vessels receive the nutrients they require, biological repair systems begin to activate. This does not mean every disease disappears, but in many chronic conditions driven by lifestyle, heart disease, metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, the underlying processes can slow, stabilize, and sometimes move in the opposite direction. I did not experience a miracle. What I experienced was something quieter, but far more powerful: biological correction over time. The body, when given the right conditions, often knows how to repair itself, and that realization would become the foundation of the decades that followed. What surprised me most was not that my numbers improved. Blood tests can change in a few months. That alone does not prove much. What truly convinced me was what happened over the following decade. The improvements did not disappear. They continued. My physician watched carefully as year after year my cholesterol remained lower, my blood pressure stabilized, and my fasting glucose stayed within a healthy range. The progression that had once seemed inevitable simply did not happen. And this is where the science becomes important. Because when we talk about reversing disease, we are not talking about magic. We are talking about measurable biological shifts inside the body. Take insulin resistance, for example. Many people develop type 2 diabetes gradually. Long before blood sugar rises dramatically, the body becomes resistant to insulin. Cells no longer respond efficiently to the hormone that allows glucose to enter from the bloodstream. The pancreas compensates by producing more insulin, and over time, that system begins to fail. One major contributor to insulin resistance is the accumulation of fat inside muscle and liver cells. These lipid deposits interfere with insulin signaling pathways. What researchers discovered in plant-based nutrition studies is that diets low in saturated fat and rich in whole plant foods can reduce this intracellular fat. As those lipid deposits decrease, insulin signaling begins to improve. That means glucose can enter cells more efficiently again. In several clinical studies, patients following whole food, plant-based diets experienced dramatic improvements in insulin sensitivity. Some individuals who had been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes were able, under medical supervision, to reduce or even discontinue certain medications. What changed was not only their diet, but their metabolic environment. The same principle appears in hypertension. High blood pressure is often linked to vascular stiffness and endothelial dysfunction. When the endothelium, the thin lining of the blood vessels, is healthy, it produces nitric oxide, which signals the surrounding muscles of the artery to relax. When nitric oxide production declines, arteries become less flexible and pressure increases. Leafy greens, beets, and many other vegetables contain natural nitrates that the body converts into nitric oxide. Combined with antioxidants that protect endothelial cells from oxidative damage, these foods help restore the signaling pathways that regulate vascular tone. Over time, improved endothelial function can contribute to lower blood pressure. Then there is inflammation, a silent biological force that touches nearly every chronic disease. Inflammation is a protective response when the body faces injury or infection. But when it becomes chronic, fueled by poor diet, excess saturated fat, refined sugars, and oxidative stress, it begins to damage tissues. Inside arteries, chronic inflammation accelerates plaque formation. Inside the liver, it contributes to fatty liver disease. Inside joints, it contributes to degenerative processes. Plant foods contain thousands of compounds collectively known as phytonutrients. These include flavonoids, carotenoids, and polyphenols, molecules that interact with inflammatory signaling pathways inside our cells. They help reduce oxidative stress, regulate immune responses, and support cellular repair. This is why diets rich in colorful vegetables and fruits are repeatedly associated with lower inflammatory markers in blood tests. For me, these mechanisms were not abstract ideas. They became visible through my own medical monitoring. Each year, my doctor and I reviewed the data. LDL cholesterol remained controlled. Triglycerides stayed low. Blood pressure stayed steady. My weight stabilized without deliberate calorie restriction. But what mattered most was what did not happen. The disease progression that had once seemed unavoidable simply never arrived. Friends of mine, men and women I had known for decades, followed the more common path of aging. Some developed severe coronary disease. Some faced complications from diabetes. Others struggled with worsening metabolic conditions. I do not say this with judgment. Many of them were doing what they had been taught was normal, but it reminded me how powerfully daily habits shape long-term outcomes. One moment stays with me clearly. I was 82 years old at the time. During a routine checkup, a younger physician reviewing my chart paused and asked a question. "Have you always had numbers like this?" I smiled and told him the truth. "No," I said, "I earned these numbers." What I meant was that the body responds to consistency. When you repeatedly provide the nutrients that support vascular health, fiber, antioxidants, phytonutrients, and simultaneously reduce the substances that promote inflammation and lipid accumulation, the internal chemistry of the body begins to shift. Cholesterol metabolism changes. Endothelial cells function more efficiently. Insulin signaling improves. Inflammatory pathways quiet down. None of these changes occur overnight. They unfold slowly, sometimes invisibly, across months and years. But together, they alter the trajectory of disease. I also learned something else during those decades. A plant-based diet is not merely about removing certain foods. It is about flooding the body with protective compounds that modern nutrition science is still trying to fully understand. Consider fiber alone. Most traditional diets in the past contained far more fiber than modern processed diets. Fiber feeds beneficial bacteria in the gut microbiome. These microbes produce short-chain fatty acids such as butyrate, which help regulate inflammation and support metabolic health. The gut, it turns out, plays a major role in the immune system and metabolic regulation. When the microbiome thrives on fiber-rich plant foods, it sends signals throughout the body that support metabolic stability. Over time, I came to see the human body not as a machine that inevitably breaks down, but as a dynamic biological ecosystem. What we eat feeds not only our cells, but also the trillions of microorganisms that influence digestion, immunity, and metabolism. When that ecosystem receives the nutrients it evolved to work with, the body often regains balance. This does not mean that diet alone can cure every illness. There are genetic conditions, infections, and diseases that require medical treatment far beyond nutrition. But for many of the chronic illnesses that dominate modern life, heart disease, metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, hypertension, nutrition plays a central role. And when nutrition changes dramatically, the direction of disease can change as well. I did not set out to conduct an experiment on myself. But over the decades, that is exactly what happened. And by the time I reached my 90s, the results of that experiment were unmistakable. Now, at 104 years old, I often look back at the moment when I first realized that disease is not always a fixed destination. Sometimes it is simply a direction, and directions can change. When I was younger, I believed the body slowly wore out the way an old machine does. I thought age itself was the cause of decline. But what I learned over the decades is that the body is far more adaptive than we were once taught. Cells are constantly repairing themselves. Blood vessels respond to chemical signals. Metabolism shifts according to the nutrients we provide. Even the inner lining of our arteries, the endothelium, can recover when inflammation decreases and circulation improves. The body is not passive, it is responsive. What we eat every day quietly shapes that internal environment. A diet built around whole plant foods supplies fiber that helps regulate cholesterol, antioxidants that reduce oxidative stress, and phytonutrients that calm inflammatory pathways. It supports healthy endothelial function and helps the body maintain balanced metabolism. Over time, those small biological adjustments accumulate. Cholesterol levels move downward. Blood pressure becomes more stable. Insulin sensitivity improves. In some cases, the very processes driving chronic disease begin to slow, or even reverse. This does not mean that food replaces medicine, or that every illness disappears with dietary change. Medicine saves lives, and there are diseases that require it. But what I discovered across the long arc of my life is that nutrition is not a minor detail in health. It is one of the most powerful environmental signals our biology receives every single day. When that signal improves, the body often begins repairing damage we once believed was permanent. I am not standing here at 104 because of a miracle. I am here because the body, when given the right conditions long enough, often chooses healing.